December 20, 1943. The sky over Germany is a hellscape of fire and metal. For rookie pilot Charlie Brown, his first mission has become his last. His B-17, Ye Olde Poop, is a flying corpse, engines dead, crew bleeding out, a ghost ship adrift in a sea of enemies. Suddenly, a shadow closes in. A German ace, Franz Stigler, fingers poised on the trigger. One burst of cannon fire, and it's over. He sees the devastation, the terrified young men fighting to live. This is not an enemy. This is a test of humanity. The hunter must decide, follow orders, or answer a higher call. The cold was the first enemy. At 25,000 feet over northwest Germany, the temperature plunged to 60 degrees below zero, a cold that seeped through the heated flight suits and leather jackets of the men inside the aluminum skins of their bombers, a cold that could freeze exposed skin in seconds and turn engine oil to sludge. For Second Lieutenant Charles Charlie Brown, crammed into the left side pilot's seat of the B-17F Flying Fortress, nicknamed Ye Olde Poop, the cold was a physical presence, but it was nothing compared to the ice forming in his gut. This was his first mission. Operation 7, a massive raid targeting the Focke-Wulf aircraft factory in Bremen. The factory was the heart of the German war machine, churning out the very few 90 fighters that even now, he knew, were being fueled and armed to meet them. The briefing officer at Kimballton Airfield in England had been blunt about the expected losses. They were throwing a fist of over 400 bombers at a target defended by the most concentrated and lethal air defenses in the world. The math was simple and brutal. Not all of them were coming back. Ye Olde Poop was one of 91 fortresses from the 3079th Bomb Group, straining for altitude in the pale morning light. The aircraft, a creation of immense industrial power, felt alive around him. A symphony of vibrating metal, the deep-throated roar of 4 Wright Cyclone engines, and the smell of cordite, sweat, and avgas. Behind him, 9 other young men, most still in their teens, manned their stations. There was Pinky, the co-pilot, his face a mask of forced calm. In the plexiglass nose, the bombardier, Bub, and the navigator, Doc, hunched over their charts and the Norden bomb site. In the waist, gunners Frenchy and Ecke stood by their .50 caliber machine guns, the freezing wind whipping through the open windows. At the tail, Sergeant Hugh, the tail gunner, was alone in his perspex cocoon, the most vulnerable position on the plane. They were a crew, a band of brothers forged in training, but untested in the crucible of combat. Today would be their test. The formation droned on, a vast armada painting contrails across the sky. The initial part of the flight, over the North Sea, had been deceptively quiet. Then they crossed the Dutch coast. Enemy coast ahead, someone muttered over the interphone, the VHF radio crackling with static. The calm was shattered. The first indication of hell was not the fighters, but the flak. German anti-aircraft gunners below had their measure. The sky, once clear, began to blossom with ugly black smudges. At first, the puffs were distant, a harmless abstract painting. Then they were in it. The first explosions were not sounds, but physical concussions that hammered the airframe. Thwomp, thwomp, thwomp. The B-17 shuddered violently, like a dog shaking off water. Shrapnel-jagged, hot pieces of steel screamed through the air, pinging and tearing at the thin aluminum skin. "Close one," Brown said, his voice tighter than he intended. He gripped the control yoke, his knuckles white, fighting to keep the massive bomber in tight formation. To stray was to die. The collective shield of their .5 calibers was their only hope against the fighters they knew were coming. And come they did. A frantic call from the top turret gunner, Peanut, fighters, 12 o'clock high. Jesus, there's dozens of them. They swarmed down like angry hornets, the sleek, deadly shapes of Messerschmitt Bf-10-9s and Focke Wolf W-90s. The American formation tightened further. Then the world dissolved into chaos. The air filled with the crisscrossing traces of 50 caliber bullets and the brighter, faster streaks of German 20mm cannon fire. Bombers began to die. A B-17 to their right took a direct hit in the bomb bay, erupting into a brilliant orange fireball, pieces of wing and fuselage cartwheeling away. There were no parachutes. 10 men gone in an instant. Brown's world narrowed to the instruments in front of him, the screaming of his gunners, and the need to hold steady. Left waist to pilot, they're coming around again. 2 o'clock. He banked slightly, trying to give his gunners a better angle. The noise was deafening. The engines, the guns, the roar of the wind through flak holes, the desperate shouts on the interphone. It was a coordinated attack. A Focke-Wulf 90 came head-on, a classic and terrifying frontal assault. Its wings sparkled with fire. Cannon shells, large as soda bottles, slammed into Ye Olde Poop. The aircraft jolted as if hit by a giant's fist. A shell tore through the cockpit, missing Brown's head by inches, shattering instruments and sending a shower of glass and metal splinters through the air. Another exploded in the fuselage. The No. 2 engine was hit. Brown watched, horrified, as dark smoke poured from it. Then flames began to lick back along the wing. "Feather two! Feather two!" he yelled at Pinky, who frantically hit the engine feathering button to stop the propeller from windmilling and causing more drag. It was too late. The engine was a lost cause. Almost simultaneously, the No. 4 engine was shot out. Now they were down to 2 engines on the same wing, a catastrophic loss of power. The bomber, once majestic, was now a cripple. It lurched and yawed violently, losing speed and altitude. They began to fall out of the protective formation. It was the moment every bomber crew feared. To be alone in the sky over Germany was a death sentence. "We're losing her, Charlie," Pinky shouted, fighting the controls. The interphone was a cacophony of damage reports, each one a hammer blow. "Tail gunners hit. I think he's dead. The oxygen lines are severed. Fire in the waist. Bombay's a mess. We can't jettison." The navigator, Doc, was wounded in the leg. The bombardier, Bub, had a piece of flak in his shoulder. The temperature inside the plane plummeted further as the sub-zero hurricane ripped through the gaping holes in the fuselage. Ye Olde Poop was no longer a fortress. It was a wounded, bleeding animal, trailing smoke and debris, falling behind the herd as the wolves closed in. 70 miles away, on a snow-dusted airfield near Oldenburg, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler was in a state of focused calm. He was a hunter, and today promised good hunting. At 31, he was an old man in a young man's war, a veteran of over 100 combat missions. His face was lean, his eyes carried the permanent squint of a man who spent his life searching the sun-drenched heavens for a speck of movement that meant death or glory. He stood beside his Messerschmitt Bf-29 G6, a machine he knew as intimately as his own body. It was not a comfortable aircraft, cramped, with a narrow-track landing gear that made takeoffs and landings treacherous. But in the hands of a master, it was a rapier. That morning, it was armed with a 20mm cannon firing through the propeller hub and 2 30mm machine guns in the nose, enough to tear a bomber apart. Stigler was a warrior in the service of the Third Reich, but his soul belonged to an older Germany. He had learned to fly in the pre-war Luftwaffe, a force steeped in the tradition of the Jagdflieger, the hunter pilots. His commander and mentor, the legendary Gustav Rödel, had imprinted upon him a code. "You are a knight, Franz," Rödel had told his young pilots. "You fight the enemy in the air, not the man in the parachute. If I ever hear of you shooting a man in his chute, I will shoot you down myself." It was a chivalry born of the Great War, a concept that felt increasingly alien in the brutal Total War of 1943. The alert came. The Armista, the Americans, were coming in strength toward Bremen. Stigler's squadron scrambled. He pulled on his leather helmet, settled into the tight cockpit, and felt the familiar rumble as the Daimler-Benz engine roared to life. Minutes later, he was climbing, his fighter a solitary arrow aimed for the heart of the storm. He joined the swirling melee high above Bremen. The sky was a scene of apocalyptic chaos. Dozens of bombers, hundreds of fighters, all weaving a lethal ballet. Stigler was a professional. He picked his targets, making high-speed passes through the bomber formations, his cannon hammering, feeling the recoil shudder through his airframe. He saw a B-17 fall away, streaming fire. He saw a Messerschmitt hit, spiraling down with a plume of black smoke. It was work. Brutal, efficient, and draining. After one such pass, he broke away to assess his situation. His fuel was low. His cannon ammunition was nearly spent. He had added another victory to his tally, bringing him closer to the Knight's Cross, the coveted medal that was the measure of an ace. He was about to turn for home when he saw it. A lone B-17 trailing the main stream by miles, moving slowly and erratically. It was barely above stall speed, descending in a shallow glide. It was a silhouette of utter misery. Smoke poured from two dead engines on its right wing. The entire left horizontal stabilizer and elevator were shot to ribbons, and the plexiglass nose was shattered. It was, for any German fighter pilot, the ultimate prize. A Hiervaschuss, a separation. A bomber knocked out of formation, easy prey. Stigler nudged the throttle forward. The Bf-1009 closed the distance with predatory ease. This would be quick. One clean burst into the wounded bird and it would be over. He would land, report his kill, and be one step closer to his medal. He slid in behind the bomber, his finger curling around the trigger on his control stick. He was so close he could see the details of the damage, the torn metal flapping in the slipstream. He lined up the shot. And then he hesitated. He flew closer, edging his fighter to the side, his professional curiosity piqued by the extent of the damage. How was this thing even still flying? As he pulled alongside, his cockpit just yards from the B-17's mangled waist section, the abstract concept of an enemy shattered. He saw the young, frost-rimed face of a waist gunner staring back at him with wide, terrified eyes. Through the gaping holes in the fuselage, he saw crew members huddled around their wounded, applying makeshift bandages. He saw the limp, bloodied body of the tail gunner slumped in his harness. This was not a machine of war. This was a flying hospital, a charnel house of young men fighting a desperate, losing battle just to stay alive. In that moment, Franz Stigler was no longer a soldier of the Reich. He was a pilot, looking at other pilots. He heard the ghost of Gustav Rodel's voice in his head. "I will shoot you down myself." To fire on this crippled plane would be no different than shooting a man parachuting to Earth. It would be murder. His finger fell away from the trigger. The hunter had found his prey, but the man had found his conscience. The war, for this one moment, in this one tiny pocket of sky, had stopped. And a decision, more dangerous than any dogfight, now had to be made. The world had shrunk to the narrow space between two wingtips. Inside the shattered cockpit of Ye Olde Pulk, Charlie Brown's mind raced, a frantic calculator trying to solve an equation with no rational answer. The German fighter was there, so close he could see the pilot's goggles, the Black Eagle insignia on the fuselage, the unmistakable shape of the Messerschmitt's propeller spinner. It held formation with an unnerving precision, a hawk gliding beside a wounded dove. "He's just sitting there," Brown muttered, his voice a dry rasp. He expected, at any second, to see the flicker of muzzle fire from the fighter's nose, the final, merciful burst that would end their struggle. But it never came. The German pilot made no aggressive moves. He simply flew. "What in God's name is he doing?" Pinky breathed, his own hands frozen on the controls. A torrent of confused, panicked reports flooded the interphone. "He's right on our wing. I can't get a shot," from the waist gunner. "Is he out of ammo? Is he toying with us?" from the top turret. Brown's military training screamed one thing. An enemy fighter in close formation was a threat to be neutralized. Every instinct told him to push the control yoke forward, to dive, to jink, to make his bomber a harder target. But a deeper, more primal instinct held him steady. The German had had a perfect kill shot. He hadn't taken it. This was not a trap. It was a tableau, a silent communication in the language of flight. To make a sudden, evasive move now might be misinterpreted as hostility, provoking the attack they had so miraculously been spared. He keyed his interphone, his voice cutting through the static and the howling wind. "All crew, hold your fire. I repeat, do not fire on that fighter." The order felt alien, treasonous even, but it was the only thing that made sense in this upside-down reality. Through the fractured plexiglass of his windshield, Brown stared across the divide. He saw the German pilot now, not as a faceless Nazi, but as a man. He saw him raise a hand from his cockpit, not in a wave, but in a series of deliberate gestures. He pointed downward, emphatically, toward the German countryside below. Then he made a slicing motion across his throat, the universal sign for cut your engines. He wants us to land, Brown said, the realization dawning with a fresh wave of dread. To land in Germany meant becoming a prisoner of war. It meant the end of the fight, but it also meant survival for his wounded crew. It was a logical, even merciful suggestion from a tactical perspective. A landed bomber was a captured bomber, its secrets laid bare, its crew removed from the war. A destroyed bomber was just debris and dead men. But Brown looked at his instruments. His altimeter was unwinding steadily. They were below 10,000 feet now and losing height. The two remaining engines were overstressed, gulping fuel at an alarming rate. The controls were sloppy, the aircraft responding like a drugged whale. A controlled landing, even if they could find a suitable field, was a fantastical notion. The B-17 was likely to cartwheel and disintegrate on impact, and if they survived the crash, they would be at the mercy of the German soldiers who would undoubtedly swarm the site. The image of his wounded navigator, Doc, and his dead tail gunner, Hugh, hardened his resolve. He shook his head at the German pilot, a slow, deliberate motion. He then pointed a finger forward, toward the west, toward the North Sea and England. "We're going home." In the cockpit of the Bf-109, Franz Stigler felt a surge of frustration. The American was refusing salvation. Didn't he understand? To continue flying this wreck was a suicide pact. Stigler had seen the shredded tail, the dead engine. He could see the crew struggling inside the frozen cavern of the fuselage. They would never make the coast. They would either plunge into the cold earth of Germany or into the colder waters of the North Sea. He pointed down again, more insistently. Land. Surrender. The American pilot shook his head again and pointed west. Stigler felt a grudging respect for the man's stubborn courage. He was a fellow pilot, determined to bring his ship home. It was a feeling Stigler understood intimately. His mind worked through the problem with a cool, tactical clarity. The immediate threat was not from him, but from the ground. They were now passing over the flak belts that protected the coastal approaches. The German anti-aircraft gunners below would see this lone, slow-moving B-17 as the easiest target of their day. A single, crippled bomber was a gunnery drill. They would fill the sky with steel until it fell. He had to get them through this. But how? An idea, both brilliant and insane, formed in his mind. He edged the Messerschmitt even closer, tucking his wingtip so near to the massive bomber that the turbulence made his own light fighter shudder. He was now flying in tight, formal formation with the B-17 wingtip to wingtip. To any observer on the ground, it would present a confusing picture. It would look as if the German fighter had already made its kill and was now escorting the disabled bomber, shepherding it toward a German airfield for a forced landing. It was a ruse, a performance for an audience of thousands of flak gunners. He looked over at the American pilot and gave a sharp, commanding nod, hoping the man would understand the unspoken plan. "Stay steady. Follow my lead." The first flak battery opened up below. Black puffs of smoke blossomed a few thousand feet beneath them, a ranging shot. Then another battery joined in. The explosions crept closer. Inside the Ye Olde Pube, the crew braced for the end. This was it. They had survived the fighters only to be blasted apart by their own ground fire, or so they thought. But the deadly flowers of black smoke stopped. The gunners on the ground had seen the strange pair. The Messerschmitt, a clean, sleek symbol of the Luftwaffe, was flying escort for the mortally wounded fortress. It was an unusual sight, but not an illogical one. The assumption was made, the bomber was captured, it was being forced down. They held their fire. To shoot it down would be to destroy a prize and kill a fellow German pilot. For long, agonizing minutes, the two aircraft, mortal enemies by design, flew in concert. The B-17, a lumbering, dying beast, and the Bf-109, its agile, predatory shadow, became a single entity in the sky. They were a living paradox, a secret pact of humanity written in contrails against the canvas of war. Brown, his heart hammering against his ribs, began to understand. The German wasn't just observing, he was protecting them. He was using his own aircraft as a shield, a passport through the deadliest airspace in Europe. The reality of it was so staggering it was difficult to comprehend. This man, this enemy, was risking everything: his career, his freedom, perhaps his life, to give them a chance. As the German countryside began to give way to the patchwork of farms and dunes that marked the coastline, Stigler knew his time was running out. His fuel gauge was dipping dangerously low. He could not follow them out to sea. He had to turn back. They broke through the final coastal flak belt. Ahead lay the grey, wind-swept expanse of the North Sea. The sight of the water, as forbidding as it was, represented a slender thread of hope. It was the beginning of the long, impossible journey home. Stigler flew one last pass, pulling ahead of the B-17 and then banking around to fly past the cockpit one final time. He looked at the American pilot, and in a gesture that transcended language and nationality, he saluted. It was not a Nazi salute, but a crisp, formal military salute from one warrior to another. It said, "The way is clear. Your fate is now in your own hands and the hands of your God." Then he dipped his wing, banked his Messerschmitt sharply to the left, and turned back toward Germany, disappearing into the haze as quickly as he had appeared. The sky was suddenly, terrifyingly empty. The ghostly escort was gone. The silence in the cockpit of Ye Olde Pool was heavier than any noise that had come before. They were alone again, a crippled ship on a vast and hostile ocean. But they were alive. And as Charlie Brown wrestled with the sluggish controls, pointing the nose of his bomber toward a home that was over 300 miles of freezing water away, he carried with him the indelible, inexplicable image of the enemy who had chosen to be a savior. The mystery of why would haunt him for the next 50 years. The silence inside Ye Olde Pool was a physical presence, thick and heavy, broken only by the agonized moan of the wind through the shattered airframe and the labored, uneven roar of the two remaining engines. The German fighter was gone. The protective shadow had vanished back into the Reich from whence it came, leaving the American bomber alone over the cold, grey vastness of the North Sea. For Charlie Brown, slumped in the left seat, the reality of their situation was a crushing weight. The miraculous reprieve was over. Now, the grim calculus of survival resumed. Navigator to pilot. Doc's voice was weak, strained with pain. "I've got a rough fix. We're about 320 miles from the English coast. Current heading might get us there, but with this drift, it was an impossible distance." They were losing altitude slowly but inexorably, a wounded bird gliding on a failing wing. The controls were mushy, the aircraft responding with a sluggish reluctance that spoke of its mortal wounds. Brown and Pinky fought the yaw, their boots pressing against the rudder pedals in a constant, fatiguing battle to keep the nose pointed west. "Engineer, what's our fuel situation?" Brown asked, dreading the answer. A static-filled pause. "Not good, Skipper. We're burning through what we've got left at a hell of a rate. The gauges on 2 and 4 are shot, but I'd be surprised if we have more than an hour, maybe less. An hour. 300 miles. The math was a death sentence. The sea below was a churning, ice-flecked grave. The life rafts were, in theory, accessible, but in the sub-zero temperatures, with wounded men, survival in a raft would be measured in minutes, not hours. "All right, listen up," Brown said, his voice firm, forcing a confidence he did not feel into the interphone. "We're not ditching, not today. We're going to lighten this bird up as much as we can. Everything that isn't bolted down goes. Guns, ammunition, any equipment you can pry loose, toss it." The crew, moving like automatons through their pain and exhaustion, began the desperate ritual of jettisoning their own firepower. The heavy .50 caliber machine guns, their barrels still warm, were wrenched from their mounts and shoved out the gaping holes in the fuselage. Ammunition boxes, oxygen bottles, flak jackets, anything with weight was sacrificed to the sea. Each item that vanished into the grey waves below was a kilogram of hope, a tiny increment of lift purchased for their struggling aircraft. As they worked, the unspoken question hung in the frozen air, more palpable than the cold. What the hell happened back there? The image of the German pilot, so close they could see his face, his gestures, his final salute, was burned into every man's mind. It was a story no one would ever believe. In the brutal binary logic of total war, it made no sense. An enemy ace had not only spared them, but had shepherded them through the deadliest airspace in Europe. It was a divine intervention, but one performed by a messenger from the other side. Meanwhile, Franz Stigler was also wrestling with the silence. His flight back to his base at Jevar was a lonely, introspective journey. The adrenaline of the encounter had faded, leaving behind a cold knot of anxiety in his stomach. He had violated a fundamental, unspoken law of the Nazi state. Total war admitted no mercy. To spare an enemy, especially a heavy bomber that had just participated in the destruction of a German city, was not an act of chivalry, it was treason. The Gestapo, who had their tentacles in every unit, would see it not as honor, but as defeatism, as sympathy for the enemy, a crime punishable by execution. He landed his Bf-1009, the engine coughing its last as he taxied to his dispersal point. The ground crew swarmed the aircraft, checking for damage, refueling, rearming. The crew chief looked up at him. "Any luck, Herr Oberleutnant? We heard the flak was heavy." Stigler swung himself out of the cockpit, his body stiff with tension. He forced a neutral expression. "I got one," he said, his voice flat. "A B-17, confirmed." It was a lie of omission, but a necessary one. To claim a victory he did not score was a stain on his honor, but to admit the truth was a death sentence. The single victory from the earlier dogfight would have to suffice. He made a vague gesture. "Then I was low on fuel and ammunition, had to break off." It was a plausible, military-sound excuse. The out-of-ammo factor, a tactical reality, became his moral alibi, a shield for his conscience. He buried the secret deep, a festering worry he dared share with no one, not even his closest comrades. In the evenings, in the officers' mess, he drank his schnapps and listened to the boasts of other pilots, their talk of kills and tactics. He would nod, a silent participant in the warrior culture, all the while seeing in his mind's eye the terrified young faces in the dying fortress. He wondered if they had made it. Had his gamble, his insane escort, been enough? Or had he merely delayed their inevitable plunge into the sea? The question would haunt him for decades. Back over the North Sea, a new miracle was unfolding. The brutal lightning of Ye Olde Puber had worked. The altimeter's descent slowed, then stabilized. They were holding a precarious 1,500 feet above the waves, the spray from the whitecaps sometimes visible through the broken nose. The two overstressed engines continued their defiant roar, drinking the last of the fuel. Then a crackle on the radio, a faint, beautiful sound. "Any Allied aircraft, this is Darky Controller, do you read? Over." Pinky nearly wept with relief. "We read you, Darky, we read you. This is B-17, Ye Olde Pool. We are badly damaged, lost, low on fuel. Request bearing and emergency landing instructions. Over." The controller's voice was a lifeline. He guided them, using their weak radio signal for direction finding. They were closer than they thought. The English coast was a smudge on the horizon. Hope, a feeling they had forgotten, began to flutter weakly in their chests. But the ordeal was not over. As the green fields of England rose to meet them, Brown faced his next impossible challenge, landing a nearly uncontrollable aircraft. The hydraulics were shot. The landing gear would have to be cranked down manually by the flight engineer, a back-breaking process. The flaps were unreliable, and the dead tail gunner, Hugh, was still at his post. They could not land with a body in the tail. The impact could be catastrophic. "Engineer, you and the radio op," Brown ordered, his voice grim. "You have to move, Hugh. Get him amidships, secure him." It was a horrific, somber task, a final indignity for their fallen comrade, but a necessary one for the living. They lined up for the runway at an emergency field. The tower saw their condition and cleared everything. Fire trucks and ambulances lined the perimeter, their flashing lights a silent acknowledgement of the expected crash. Brown fought the controls, sweat stinging his eyes despite the cold. The runway rushed up to meet them. They were too fast, the aircraft too heavy with its own damage. The wheels touched down with a screech of protest. The bomber slewed, the damaged right wing dipping dangerously. Brown and Pinky slammed on the opposite rudder and brakes, fighting to keep her straight. For a terrifying second, it seemed they would ground loop and tear themselves apart. But the rugged frame of the fortress held. They shuddered to a stop at the very end of the tarmac, surrounded by emergency vehicles. The silence that followed was absolute. For a long moment, no one moved. They were down. They were alive. They had, against every conceivable odd, made it home. The debriefing that followed was an anticlimax of a different kind. In a sterile room facing stone-faced intelligence officers, Charlie Brown told his story. He described the damage, the casualties, the ferocity of the attacks. And then, haltingly, he told them about the German pilot, the Me-109 that pulled alongside, the gestures, the escort, the salute. The officers listened, their expressions shifting from professional interest to open skepticism, then to dismissive disbelief. A German fighter pilot escorted you, flew formation with you to protect you from flak? The senior officer repeated, his tone dripping with incredulity. Brown, have you and your crew been on a bender? Did the hypoxia get to you? It's the truth, sir, Brown insisted, his fatigue making him sound desperate. The truth is, Lieutenant, the officer cut him off coldly. You let a German fighter get within spitting distance of your bomber, and you didn't evade or engage. You have a dead crewman and a wrecked aircraft. The only reason you're not facing a court-martial for dereliction of duty is the condition of your plane and your crew's wounds. This fairy tale ends now. It didn't happen. Do you understand me? It did not happen. The official report was filed. The story of the chivalrous German ace was deemed a combat-induced fantasy, a hallucination born of trauma and oxygen deprivation. The incident was classified, buried not in the archives of heroism, but in the files of psychological breakdown. Charlie Brown was ordered to never speak of it again. And so, the secret was buried on both sides of the war. One man forced into silence by his superiors, another by the terror of his own regime. The moment of humanity was sealed away, a hidden seed that would take nearly half a century to germinate. The war ground on, and both Franz Stigler and Charlie Brown returned to the business of killing, the memory of their strange meeting, a quiet, persistent ghost in the machine of war. The war, a voracious beast that had consumed continents and lives with indiscriminate appetite, finally ended. The guns fell silent in Europe in May of 1945, and in the Pacific that September. The silence that followed was not one of peace, but of exhaustion, a world holding its breath, surveying the incalculable wreckage. For the millions who had fought, the transition back to a world without war was a battle of a different kind. For Charlie Brown and Franz Stigler, the end of hostilities meant the beginning of a long, private struggle with a ghost. Charlie Brown returned to the United States, to the rolling hills of West Virginia. He married, started a family, and built a life. He went to college on the GI Bill, eventually becoming a State Department Foreign Service officer. He was, by all outward appearances, a successful man, a veteran who had done his duty and moved on. But the interior landscape of his mind was forever marked by the events of December 20th, 1943. The memory of the German pilot was a persistent, haunting refrain. In quiet moments, while mowing the lawn or staring out a window, he would see it again, the sleek grey Messerschmitt sliding into view, the pilot's goggled face, the deliberate gestures, the final, stunning salute. It was a memory that felt increasingly fragile, a dream that might dissolve upon closer inspection. The official reprimand, the threat of a court-martial, had done its work. He had buried the story, as ordered. But you cannot bury something that is alive. The question why festered like a splinter in his soul. Had it been real, or was it, as his superiors had insisted, a hallucination born of hypoxia and terror? The doubt was its own special kind of torture. He would sometimes take out the crumpled, yellowing mission report, reading the dry, clinical language that described the damage to his aircraft, the casualties, but made no mention of the miracle. He felt a debt, an unpaid bill of gratitude that weighed on him. The man, whoever he was, had given them their lives. He deserved to be known, to be thanked. And Brown needed, for his own sanity, to confirm that the most profound moment of his life had not been a fiction. His search began in fits and starts, a hobbyist's pursuit in an age before the internet. He wrote letters to military archives, both American and German. The responses were polite, unhelpful. There was no record, no after-action report from the German side that matched such an improbable event. The Luftwaffe's records were a scattered, incomplete mess destroyed in bombings, lost in the chaotic final collapse of the Reich. It was like searching for a single, specific snowflake that had fallen in a blizzard years ago. He attended 379th Bomb Group reunions. Sitting in hotel banquet halls with the grizzled old men who had been the boys of his youth, he would cautiously broach the subject. Over Bremen, that first mission, did anyone ever hear anything about a German pilot, letting a crew go? The responses were always the same, a shake of the head, a pat on the back, a look of pity. Charlie, that was a rough one. We lost a lot of guys. You're lucky to have made it back at all. The story was too incredible. It belonged to the realm of myth, not the brutal documented history of the bloody skies over Europe. The flame of his quest, flickering weakly, was constantly threatened by the winds of reality and disbelief. For Franz Stigler, the end of the war was not a return, but a collapse. The Germany he had served, the cause for which he had fought, lay in utter ruins, exposed as a monstrous crime. The chivalrous code of the Jagdflieger felt like a pathetic relic in the shadow of the Holocaust. He had survived the war, one of the lucky few from the early days, but survival came with its own burdens. He had never spoken of the B-17. The secret was a cold stone in his heart, a private act of defiance against the regime that was now rightly condemned. In the immediate aftermath of the war, he faced the practical struggle for survival, avoiding capture by the Soviets, finding food, navigating the rubble of a defeated nation. He eventually emigrated to Canada in 1953, seeking a clean slate in the new land. He settled in Vancouver, built a successful business, and like Brown, married and raised a family. He became a Canadian citizen, leaving his past as a Luftwaffe ass behind him. But the past is not a country. One can simply depart. The memory of the crippled fortress and its crew was a ghost that crossed the ocean with him. He would look at his children and wonder if the young men in that bomber had lived to have children of their own. He assumed they had not. The aircraft was so terribly damaged. He had watched it limp away, a sinking ship, and had always believed it must have gone down in the North Sea. The thought filled him with a profound, private sorrow. His act of mercy, he was convinced, had only granted them a few more minutes of life. The guilt was irrational. He had done all any man could, but it was persistent. He had saved them from one death only to, he believed, deliver them to another. He, too, kept his silence. In a post-war world still raw from Nazi atrocities, who would want to hear a story of German chivalry? It would be misunderstood, seen as glorification or a lie. The memory was his alone to bear, a sacred, painful relic of a time when he had managed to be a man first and a soldier second. The years turned into decades. The 1960s bled into the 70s, and the 70s into the 80s. The world changed, but the frozen moment in the sky over Germany remained unchanged in the minds of the two aging men. Charlie Brown's search intensified as he approached retirement. The flame of his quest, once a flicker, was now a determined pilot light. He was running out of time. The men who might remember were dying off. If he did not find the answer now, it would be lost forever. He began to employ a new, more systematic approach. He gathered every piece of data he could, the exact time of the encounter, their estimated position, the type of German fighter, a Bef-29G6, he was sure of it now. He cross-referenced Luftwaffe wing deployments. He wrote to German veteran associations, his letters now more precise, more desperate. Then, in 1986, a breakthrough. A letter arrived from a researcher in Germany. It contained a list of names, pilots from JG-11, the wing stationed in the area that day. One name was marked with a note, Oberleutnant Franz Stigler. Known to be a very chivalrous pilot, a student of Gustav Hödel, he is now living in Canada. Brown's heart hammered against his ribs. The distance between them, once an ocean and a war, had shrunk to a national border. He wrote a letter to the address provided, his hand trembling slightly. He described the mission, the crippled B-17, the incredible actions of the German pilot. He ended with a simple, powerful question. Were you the one? The letter travelled to Vancouver. When Franz Stigler opened it and began to read, the decades fell away. He was back in the cockpit, the cold air rushing past, the massive, wounded bomber filling his vision. He read Brown's description of the tail gunner's body, the shattered nose, the struggling crew. Tears welled in his eyes. They had made it. All these years he had carried the weight of their assumed deaths, and they had lived. The sorrow he had carried for 43 years lifted, replaced by an overwhelming, incredulous joy. He immediately sat down and wrote back. Yes, he wrote, I was the one. He described his own perspective, seeing the mortally wounded plane, realizing it was a flying hospital, remembering his commander's code, the desperate escort through the flak. He confirmed the gestures, the attempt to get them to land, the final salute. I thought you went into the sea, Stigler wrote. To know you made it home is the best news I have received in all these years. When Charlie Brown received that letter, he held in his hands the validation he had sought for nearly half a century. It was real. It had happened exactly as he remembered. The ghost was made flesh. The mystery had a name. Franz Stigler. The two old warriors, one in West Virginia, one in British Columbia, began a fervent correspondence, filling pages with their lives, their memories, their shared history. The long silence was broken. The next step was a voice, and after the voice, a face. The reunion, an event neither man had ever dared to dream of, was now inevitable.